The van was gone. Not stolen. Not misplaced. It was towed by the HOA. And inside that van? Over 30 grand of specialized K-9 training equipment, 2 federally tagged bomb detection kits, and a prosthetic leg extension custom fit to my wife by the Department of Defense. Oh, and the cherry on top? They towed it without knowing that the woman they were messing with holds federal clearance and trains dogs that can sniff out explosives, narcotics, and, apparently, narcissists in HOA polos. When I tell you they picked the wrong driveway to mess with, I mean it in every possible way. Our cul-de-sac had always been quiet, the kind of place where neighbors wave half-heartedly while dragging trash cans to the curb and gossip over power washing technique. I never imagined it would become the setting for a full-blown federal response, sparked by one entitled HOA president who couldn't mind her own business and thought she could override the Americans with Disabilities Act because she didn't like how my wife's van looked. It wasn't a rusted-out clunker. It was a government-approved ADA-modified Dodge Ram with ramp access, elevated sensors, reinforced cargo sections, and a neatly printed permit behind the windshield. But none of that mattered to Karen. Karen thought the van made the neighborhood look militant. She actually used that word, militant, because heaven forbid a disabled veteran have reliable transportation. That morning had started like any other. Kate had just returned from the training field. She works early, leaves before sunrise and is back by 9 a.m. sharp. She's not just a dog trainer. She's one of the lead instructors for a federal K-9 program that contracts with 3-letter agencies I'm technically not even supposed to name. Titan, her latest trainee, was an enormous Belgian Malinois with more discipline than most grown men. He sat perfectly still as Kate pulled up into our driveway, tail thumping softly, harness gleaming under the sun. She eased the van into our marked space, clicked the remote to lower the ramp, and guided Titan inside. 10 minutes later, the chaos began. Kate was in the kitchen when she heard the unmistakable sound of a diesel engine, low, grinding, and far too close. She glanced out the front window and saw it, a tow truck backing into our driveway. Titan immediately stood alert, sensing her tension. She rushed outside, limp and all, waving her ID and yelling that the vehicle was federally registered. The driver, chewing gum like he was trying to win a contest, shrugged and said he had orders from the HOA president lady. That would be Karen. Clipboard-carrying Karen. HOA overlord Karen. She had called in a tow on an ADA-compliant, federally tagged vehicle. Kate tried reason. She explained the ADA protections. She showed paperwork. She even opened the rear of the van to reveal the clearly marked K-9 unit gear crate. The driver wouldn't budge. He said he'd lose his job if he left without the van. Kate threatened legal action. He said, "Get in line, lady." Then he hit the lever and hoisted the front end of the van like it was just another beat-up Buick. And just like that, they drove away with the dog gear, the prosthetics, and a GPS tag that would set off an alert the moment the van passed outside a geofenced zone. I got the call right after my morning meeting. Kate rarely called during the day unless it was important. Her voice was calm but clipped. She told me what happened. I didn't even hang up before I was out the door, grabbing my keys, shoes untied, adrenaline already pounding in my ears. I wasn't just furious, I was stunned. This wasn't a random accident. This was a deliberate power move by someone who thought HOA rules outranked federal law. When I got home, Kate had already filed a federal report. The K-9 van, because of its internal security systems and transport functionality, was fitted with a government-issued GPS beacon. When it moved without proper clearance, it triggered a silent alert to her case supervisor, who flagged the incident as a possible equipment theft. What that meant, in bureaucratic terms, was that Karen had just turned a neighborhood power trip into an active federal investigation. Still, Kate was composed. She was already prepping Titan for a scent detection test in the backyard like nothing had happened. That's her way, disciplined, focused. I, on the other hand, was spinning. I asked if we should go confront Karen. She said no. Let them dig the hole deeper. An hour later, Kate got a call back from her contact. The van's GPS pinged at a local tow yard 15 miles outside of town. The agent asked her, "Why wasn't this vehicle registered for removal?" Kate answered, "Because it was parked in my driveway. You could practically hear the wheels turning on the other end. Federal equipment improperly handled. Possible tampering with specialized devices. Potential loss of a prosthetic medically coded as necessary for work and mobility." It was a cascade of violations, each one heavier than the last. And Karen? She had no idea. While the HOA newsletter warned of unsightly vehicles and non-conforming residents, they never expected to be audited by the federal government for unlawful seizure of a transport asset. But that's exactly where this was heading. Karen's phone call had initiated a chain of events with legal, financial, and possibly criminal consequences. And all because she didn't like how a van looked in the driveway. She saw a violation. The government saw a breach. I remember looking at Kate that night as we sat in the garage, Titan curled up at her feet, her empty ramp now folded in place with no van in sight. She wasn't angry. She was patient. She was calculating. And when she looked at me and said, "I'm not letting this go," I believed her. Karen had poked the wrong bear. She thought she was dealing with a regular resident. What she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly imagine, was that my wife trains federal K-9 units for anti-terrorism response. That her van was considered a secured asset. That her ID didn't just say trainer, it said authorized federal personnel. And that Titan? He was trained to take down threats 10 times smarter than a clipboard-wielding suburban tyrant. The game had changed. Karen just didn't know it yet. The thing about federal K-9 units is they're not just about dogs. They're about logistics, tracking, security clearances, and an entire infrastructure of equipment that, when mishandled, sets off a chain reaction most civilians aren't prepared for. Karen wasn't just about to get a slap on the wrist. She was about to discover what happens when you yank on a leash that's wired directly to Washington. By the next morning, Kate's phone had blown up. Her supervisor had passed the information to the Federal Logistics Division, who flagged the van's movement as unauthorized. A formal alert had been filed. Since the tow involved sensitive equipment, some of which wasn't even legally supposed to be outside Kate's possession, a field compliance team was mobilized. No lights, no sirens. Just 2 government-issued black SUVs pulling up to the local tow yard, quiet as shadows. The drivers were calm, polite, and holding clipboards with words like "inventory breach" and "code lock override" typed in blocky government font. The tow yard owner looked like he wanted to melt into the concrete when they started asking for documentation. Of course, there wasn't any. Kate and I stood behind the chain-link fence watching it all unfold. I'd never seen a tow yard operator turn that pale that fast. The man who'd blown her off just yesterday was now trying to explain how he had no idea the van contained federal asset. One of the agents calmly opened the rear hatch and began snapping photos of the gear cases inside. All of it was labeled, logged, and traceable. He didn't say much, but I saw his eyes narrow when he spotted the sealed detection module bolted to the interior. That alone would have been enough to warrant a security review. When the agent turned around and asked who authorized the removal of the van, the owner immediately threw Karen under the bus. He pointed to the job ticket. "It says HOA President, Karen Lentz." He spelled it out like it would help save him. The agent wrote it down without blinking. Then he looked at Kate and asked, "Would you like to press charges for unauthorized seizure of a federally secured vehicle?" Kate didn't answer right away. She just looked at me, then back at him, and said, "Not yet." Back in the neighborhood, Karen was having a completely different kind of morning. Unaware that she was now on record as the initiator of what could easily spiral into a federal case, she had taken to the neighborhood Facebook group to brag. She posted a lengthy rant about standards and unauthorized military vehicles, and how she saved the community from becoming one of those neighborhoods. The comments section exploded. At first, her loyal inner circle chimed in with the usual cheerleading, "Thank you for keeping our streets clean, Karen," and finally, someone doing something about the eyesores. But it didn't take long for reality to bite. One neighbor posted a photo of Kate in uniform, standing next to Titan with a row of decorated officers behind her. The caption read, "You towed the vehicle of a disabled veteran who trains federal service dogs. Still feel good about this?" That was all it took. Within hours, the thread turned into a battleground. Neighbors demanded an emergency meeting. A few posted that they'd contacted the local news. Screenshots were being saved and shared faster than Karen could delete them. But the best part? One resident revealed they had a Ring camera that caught the entire tow on video, including Karen directing the truck driver from the sidewalk. That night, Karen tried to do damage control. She walked around the neighborhood with her clipboard like nothing happened, stopping to smile and wave as if she hadn't just caused a federal investigation. When she knocked on our door, I opened it just enough for her to see Titan sitting calmly behind me, watching her like a hawk. She had the audacity to ask if we could talk like adults. Kate didn't even come to the door. She just called out from the kitchen, "Tell her to talk to our lawyer." The following morning, we received an official ADA violation notice. Not for us, for the HOA. Our attorney, a sharp-tongued ADA specialist named Denise, had wasted no time. She filed a formal complaint against the HOA for unlawfully interfering with mobility assets belonging to a service animal handler. She also requested damages for emotional distress, loss of use of federally issued medical equipment, and breach of federally protected property rights. The figure she included wasn't small. Karen still didn't seem to get it. She doubled down. She issued a community-wide memo claiming she had followed proper protocol and had every right to remove any vehicle not pre-approved by the board. She referred to Kate's ADA paperwork as unclear and the van as a security concern. That last part was her fatal mistake. 2 days later, a DHS liaison arrived at our home. Not in uniform, but definitely not low profile. He introduced himself, confirmed Kate's ID and service status, then handed her a document confirming that her vehicle was now formally flagged as a federal transport asset. He said, in very calm terms, "Any further tampering will be treated as interference with federal operations." I wish I could say Karen took that warning seriously. But no. She did the most Karen thing possible. She called another emergency HOA board meeting. She stood in front of 30 baffled homeowners and announced that she was under attack by extremists who were using their government contacts to intimidate community leaders. I almost choked when I heard it. Karen was trying to spin this as if she were the victim. One neighbor raised their hand and said, "So you're saying you towed a federal van by mistake, and now the government is retaliating?" Karen nodded like it made sense. Another neighbor stood up and said, "No, Karen. You committed a felony. That's not retaliation. That's consequences." Kate and I didn't attend the meeting in person. But our attorney did. She sat in the back, quietly recording the whole thing on her phone. And when Karen started ranting about unauthorized surveillance vehicles and military-grade vans, Denise calmly stood up and read aloud the exact federal statute Karen had violated. The silence was deafening. By the end of that day, at least 4 families in the neighborhood had submitted formal requests to review HOA board practices. 2 others publicly stated they were withholding dues until new leadership was elected. And someone, bless their soul, put up a yard sign that said, "HOA equals Hysterical Overreaction Association." Karen was losing control, and she knew it. But she still had no idea how much worse it was about to get. Because Titan's detection module hadn't just recorded GPS data. It had also captured audio inside the van at the time of the tow. And that audio included Karen's voice, giving permission to haul that eyesore away, even after being informed it was a service vehicle. It was the kind of recording that lawyers dream about and entitled people fear. Karen had gone from clipboard tyrant to federally scrutinized in less than 72 hours. And Kate? She was just getting started. The tow yard drama had only been the opening act. What followed was a domino fall of increasingly bad decisions by Karen and the HOA board, each one more catastrophic than the last. With the Department of Homeland Security now paying close attention and our attorney Denise sharpening her legal blades, things were getting serious. But Karen, in her infinite arrogance, still believed she could spin this. Still believed she was untouchable. The problem was, she didn't understand that this wasn't just a neighborly dispute anymore. This was a federal issue, and every new step she took was one deeper into quicksand. The next week kicked off with what we called the inspection. 2 plain-clothed government officials came back to the tow yard, this time with a technician and a secure transport van of their own. They were there to retrieve the equipment and perform a chain of custody audit. Kate accompanied them. She stood silently while they opened her van, checking each item against the manifest. Every K-9 harness, training explosive mock-up, prosthetic storage unit, and sensor device had to be accounted for. One of the boxes had been cracked open. That alone raised alarms. Federal training gear isn't just expensive, it's also legally protected under very specific handling requirements. Mishandling it, even unintentionally, can trigger fines and legal proceedings, especially if someone outside the chain of command accessed it. Karen had no idea how close she was to an indictment. While the inspection was taking place, Karen decided to hold yet another emergency HOA meeting. The previous one had not gone her way, and this time, she came prepared with a stack of printed papers and a folding table set up like she was presenting a high school science fair project. According to one of our neighbors who attended, she opened the meeting with the phrase, "We are under siege." She claimed that government cronies were interfering in local affairs and accused Kate of weaponizing her disability for power. The room went silent. Someone whispered, "She really said that?" But Karen wasn't done. She started accusing residents of conspiring against her, claimed that our attorney was harassing the board, and suggested that Kate and I planted the equipment in the van to escalate things. It was the kind of bizarre logic spiral only a true HOA Karen could manufacture. Of course, it didn't take long for the fallout to reach the rest of the neighborhood. Screenshots of her claims hit the community group chat within an hour. One neighbor, a retired Army vet, publicly called her out. He posted, "I've seen combat. This is a lady losing her mind over a van." Another resident mentioned they were calling the local ADA compliance officer to report potential discrimination. Denise, ever the tactician, submitted another legal notice, this one directly to the HOA's insurance provider. She argued that the HOA board was engaged in willful negligence and exposing the association to massive liability. The insurance company responded by freezing the board's discretionary spending until the investigation concluded. That meant no more HOA-funded landscaping, no newsletter printing, and, hilariously, no more catered lunches for board members. Karen had unknowingly cut off her own perk. In the middle of all this chaos, Kate decided to hold a public dog demonstration at the local park. It wasn't out of spite, it was just something she'd already planned, long before any of this happened. But the timing was perfect. She set up a little area where Titan and 2 other service dogs performed obedience routines, scent detection runs, and mobility assists. Word got out fast, and half the neighborhood showed up. Kids loved it. Parents were impressed. Several residents asked about training their own dogs with Kate. It was calm, fun, and filled with smiles, until Karen stormed in. She marched straight up to Kate, flanked by 2 of her remaining loyal board members, and demanded that the event be shut down. She said it was an unauthorized community gathering on HOA land. Kate calmly reminded her that the park was owned by the city, not the HOA. That was when Karen made her final, fatal misstep. She pointed at Titan and said, That animal is dangerous and shouldn't be around children." Titan, as if understanding every word, sat perfectly still, then barked once, loud, sharp, and on command. The timing was so perfect it felt scripted. The entire crowd gasped, then started laughing. One little girl yelled, "Good dog!" Karen, humiliated, turned red and stormed off, nearly tripping over her own feet. That single moment, Titan's bark, Karen's meltdown, the laughter of neighbors, became the turning point. People who had stayed neutral began openly criticizing the HOA. Others who had supported Karen quietly backed away, pretending they'd never agreed with her to begin with. The rest of the board called for a vote to limit the president's unilateral powers. Karen refused. That forced a snap election. Within 3 days, ballots were printed, dropped in mailboxes, and collected by the end of the week. The community voted in favor of immediate leadership restructuring. Karen lost her position in a landslide. She wasn't just removed from the presidency, she was removed from the board entirely. One of her former allies tried to challenge the vote, but our attorney reminded them that interfering with the process could be seen as obstructing an active civil investigation. That shut him up real quick. The day after the vote, Karen sent a mass email accusing the entire neighborhood of mob behavior and vowing legal retaliation. It was filled with grammatical errors, passive-aggressive phrases, and what we could only assume were vague threats she found on a forum for disgruntled HOA presidents. No one responded. A few people blocked her email entirely. One neighbor forwarded the message to the ADA Attorney General's office for review. The rest of us celebrated. Kate's van was fully restored and returned with a fresh paint job, upgraded electronics, and a brand new federal tag on the back. It looked pristine, parked right back in its original spot in our driveway. This time, nobody dared look at it sideways. One neighbor even offered to build a little awning over it so it would blend better with the HOA color palette. We politely declined. As for Titan, he became something of a neighborhood celebrity. Kids would stop by just to see him do a trick. One family even asked if he could be the honorary bark marshal for their kid's birthday party. He handled it with professional grace, of course. Karen, meanwhile, was rarely seen outside. She started parking 2 streets over and entering her house through the side gate. A for sale sign went up in her yard 2 weeks later. And just like that, the storm passed. But we hadn't forgotten. Neither had DHS, or the ADA office, or the HOA's insurance company. Karen had poked a sleeping bear and got chased up the tree. Every bad decision she made, from the illegal tow to the slander, to her attempt to silence a disabled veteran, had led her to this. She tried to enforce rules. What she ended up enforcing was her own downfall. We never wanted a war with the HOA. But when someone declares one over a van and a dog, we don't just roll over. We bark back. Just when it seemed like Karen had finally slunk into the shadows, the real consequences of her actions began to surface. Removing her from the HOA board was only the beginning. What she hadn't counted on was the aftermath. The paperwork, the audits, the federal forms, the agency letters, and a very determined forensic accountant named Marcy. Marcy was the kind of professional who wore sharp glasses, never cracked a smile, and spoke entirely in facts, numbers, and consequences. She wasn't hired by us. She was sent by the HOA's own insurance provider after they froze all discretionary spending and flagged the board's finances for irregular activity following the legal complaints. Karen had been mismanaging the HOA funds for years without raising alarms. But now, with the federal spotlight glaring down, every dollar she ever spent on behalf of the board was up for scrutiny. And it didn't take long for Marcy to find things that didn't add up. According to Marcy's report, leaked to us by a very frustrated treasurer, Karen had used the HOA Emergency Maintenance Fund to cover the towing costs. That might have slid under the radar if she hadn't also charged a string of personal purchases to the HOA card, including an online order for a top-tier margarita machine, luxury candles, and what appeared to be a recurring monthly charge for something called garden zen coaching. There was even a digital invoice from a spa retreat labeled as board wellness session. No one on the board recalled attending any wellness sessions. The more Marcy dug, the more ridiculous it got. Karen had treated the HOA funds like her personal checking account, and it was only because of her vendetta against Kate's van that anyone had started looking. The neighbors, who had once grumbled quietly about dues and boring HOA meetings, were now holding weekly watch parties for updates. Someone even created a private subreddit titled HOA Gone Wild, where residents anonymously shared Karen's greatest hits and posted memes. One showed her with devil horns drawn on, holding a tow truck like it was a weapon. Another was just a screenshot of her community email next to the words, "Wellness fund, huh?" The laughter was therapeutic, but the facts were brutal. Karen was facing more than embarrassment. She was now personally liable for misappropriation of funds, and with the insurance company refusing to cover damages resulting from deliberate violations of ADA protections, that meant lawsuit. Multiple. Meanwhile, life in the neighborhood began to improve. With Karen gone, the new interim board started holding open forums, listening to complaints and, get this, even apologizing for the board's past behavior. People were stunned. HOA meetings weren't tense anymore. They were civil, productive, even a little fun. Kate was invited to lead a service animal awareness night at the clubhouse, where she introduced Titan and explained how federal K-9s were trained. The event was standing room only. She even did a live demo where Titan found a hidden scent marker within seconds and barked once, just like he did during the infamous park incident. The audience burst into applause. One kid yelled, "Titan's the mayor now." And honestly, if there had been a ballot, he might have won. But while Kate was building goodwill and Titan was getting the hero treatment, Karen was quietly unraveling. We heard through the grapevine that she'd tried to contact several former board members to convince them to back her in filing a countersuit. None of them bit. One of them even forwarded her messages to Denise, who added them to the growing pile of evidence showing Karen's attempts to retaliate against a disabled veteran. Then came the subpoena. A local judge, reviewing the ADA and DHS reports, approved a formal subpoena of HOA records for potential civil action. Karen's name was mentioned specifically in the court filings, not as a witness, as a respondent. And as if that wasn't enough, Titan's audio recording from the van, yes, the one that caught Karen's voice ordering the tow despite being told the van was protected, had now been officially submitted as evidence. Karen hadn't just acted ignorantly. She'd been informed. She knew. And she'd done it anyway. That clip, only 12 seconds long, might end up costing her thousands in legal fees and penalties. We listened to it once, just to hear it with our own ears. Her voice came through clearly, saying, "I don't care what paperwork she has. Get it off the property. No interpretation needed. Just raw entitlement caught on tape." But Karen wasn't the only one facing fallout. The tow yard, embarrassed and legally exposed, fired the driver who had hauled Kate's van and issued a formal apology to both her and the agency she worked for. They also agreed to a settlement to cover damages and potential liability. In the settlement letter, they referred to Karen as the initiating private party whose misrepresentations led to the unauthorized removal. Translation: if anyone was getting sued next, it was her. Then, almost poetically, the HOA received a letter from the ADA's regional office confirming that they were now under formal compliance monitoring for the next 2 years. That meant every action they took, every ticket, every complaint, every enforcement attempt, would be reviewed by an external consultant. And Kate, now something of a community icon, was asked to be part of the neighborhood advisory panel overseeing fair treatment and accessibility policy. She accepted, of course, and immediately set about rewriting half of the outdated rulebook the HOA had clung to for years. Karen, meanwhile, went silent. Her for sale sign remained up, but no showings were scheduled. She stopped appearing in public. Someone said they saw her walking her dog early in the morning, hoodie pulled low, avoiding eye contact. It was a sad sight. Even if she deserved every bit of the fallout, there was something pitiful about watching someone so consumed by control lose it all. Still, we didn't gloat. We didn't need to. The facts spoke louder than any revenge fantasy ever could. Karen had tried to flex authority she never had. She had underestimated a woman with training, a badge, and the law on her side. And she had absolutely no idea what she was dealing with when she called that tow truck. It wasn't just a van. It was a mobile extension of a federal program, protected by law, monitored by GPS, and backed by layers of bureaucracy that don't take kindly to private citizens seizing their property. What she saw as a petty neighborhood dispute had spiraled into audits, investigations, board oustings, and legal nightmares. And all she had to do to avoid it was nothing. One glance at the ADA paperwork, one moment of humility, and none of this would have happened. But Karen didn't do humility. She did control. And she controlled herself straight off a cliff. Kate, ever the professional, moved forward. She added new training modules to her K-9 program, using the van incident as a case study in her seminars. Titan kept working, though we noticed he developed a habit of barking any time he walked by Karen's house. We didn't stop him. Sometimes justice doesn't come in the form of a courtroom. Sometimes it comes in the shape of a service dog sitting tall, watching the street, and letting out a single, unmistakable bark. By the time the federal report was finalized, the damage was done, and not just to Karen's reputation, but to her entire standing in the community, in civil court, and possibly even in the eyes of the IRS. The DHS completed its internal review of the incident, and while no criminal charges were filed, likely due to the fact that Kate had opted not to pursue them, the report clearly stated that the removal of a federally tagged transport vehicle containing specialized K-9 equipment was an unauthorized act conducted without proper consultation or jurisdiction. In other words, Karen towed a government asset because she didn't like the look of it, and the government noticed. The HOA received the report via certified mail, and the newly elected board chair called an emergency open forum to share its contents with the neighborhood. Kate and I sat near the back of the room, arms folded, watching the uncomfortable expressions ripple across the crowd as the findings were read aloud. The conclusion included a warning that further incidents could result in suspension of community access to public safety programs supported by federal partnership. That was a big deal. Our neighborhood had long benefited from joint drills, early alert systems, and even disaster preparedness training through Kate's contact. All of it was now in jeopardy because one woman didn't believe the rules applied to her. To their credit, the new board took immediate steps to ensure nothing like this would ever happen again. They adopted a new accessibility policy that required all HOA decisions involving ADA-registered residents to go through a legal review before action could be taken. They also voted to require board members to undergo training on federal compliance standard. That alone sent a clear message. The age of petty tyrants in pastel cardigans was over. And in what felt like a symbolic gesture, they returned Kate's HOA fees for the year and issued a written apology signed by every remaining board member. It didn't erase what had happened, but it mattered. The van was returned not only fully repaired but better than it had ever been. The interior had been cleaned, recalibrated, and fitted with a new locking mechanism that required biometric verification. A discreet decal had been added to the rear bumper that read, in plain font, Federal K-9 Division. Unauthorized access is a federal offense. It wasn't flashy. It didn't need to be. It said everything with quiet authority. And it parked, once again, in our driveway, just where it belonged. No one ever called it an eyesore again. Titan, for his part, was thriving. His training had reached a new level of focus, almost as if he understood the weight of what had happened. He'd always been obedient, but now he carried himself with a quiet awareness that made neighbors take a second look when he walked by. Children in the community often waved when they saw him, and parents would nod respectfully toward Kate, sometimes even offering small thank yous for her work. One family gifted her a handmade tag for Titan's collar that read "Local Hero." She smiled when she put it on him and scratched behind his ear. He wagged his tail once and stood tall. One afternoon, a neighborhood family invited Kate to speak at their son's middle school for Career Day. She brought Titan, of course, and gave a demonstration on scent detection, mobility assistance, and the responsibilities of K-9 units working in federal capacities. The kids were mesmerized. They asked question after question. One even raised their hand and asked, "Did your dog help arrest anyone?" Kate chuckled and said, "He's never had to. But he makes sure people don't get any ideas." The teachers thanked her profusely, and the principal hinted at inviting her every year. Kate was modest about it, but I could see it in her eyes. This meant something to her. After everything she'd been through, she still found purpose in serving, in teaching, in showing people the power of a well-trained dog and a good heart. As for Karen, her story was nearing its end. Her house sat on the market for weeks without a single showing. Word had gotten out, through agents, neighbors, and maybe even a few online reviews, that this wasn't just any property. It came with a backstory. A lawsuit, a subpoena, and a neighborhood that would probably never forget her name. Eventually, she accepted a below-market offer from a couple moving in from out of state. The sale closed quietly, with no farewell party, no final walkthroughs, and no goodbyes. One morning, she loaded up a U-Haul, her signature cardigan tossed over one shoulder, and drove off without even a glance in the rearview mirror. As she pulled away, Titan barked once, sharp and clear. We weren't sure if he recognized the vehicle or the mood, but it felt right. Kate stood at the edge of the driveway watching her go. Not triumphantly. Not smugly. Just calmly. She leaned down, gave Titan a small pat, and said, "Good boy." Then she turned around and went back inside like the whole thing had been just another training exercise. For her, maybe it was. She had weathered storms far greater than Karen. But it meant something to see a bully stripped of her illusion of power, to know that you didn't have to scream to be heard. Sometimes all it takes is standing your ground, knowing the law is on your side, and letting the facts, and the dog, do the barking. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood changed. People were friendlier. The new board started community nights, like movie screenings in the park and neighborhood cleanup days. Kate was offered a seat on the Permanent Advisory Committee for ADA and accessibility issues. She accepted, and her first act was to have an ADA-accessible ramp installed at the clubhouse entrance, which shockingly had never been done before. Small wins, but they added up. The place felt lighter, safer, more connected. I posted the full story to r/EntitledPeople under the title "HOA towed my wife's ADA-compliant van. Didn't know she's a K-9 instructor with federal clearance." Within hours, it exploded. Thousands of upvotes, awards, and comments poured in. People couldn't believe it. The top comment read, "She towed a van with a bomb dog inside? Karen just speedran the federal watch list." Another read, "Titan needs a medal. And his own Netflix special." I read every single one out loud to Kate as she laughed into her coffee. We never wanted to go viral. But if our story helped even one person stand up to petty power trippers in their own neighborhood, then maybe it was worth it. In the end, it wasn't just about the van, or the HOA, or even Karen. It was about respect. About knowing that laws exist to protect people from exactly this kind of abuse. And about the quiet strength it takes to stand firm in the face of arrogance and ignorance. Kate never raised her voice. She never played the victim. She trained her dog, she filed her reports, and she let the truth do the heavy lifting. And if Karen didn't know that messing with a federal K-9 instructor was going to blow up in her face, well, now she does.